My research is animated by this kind of big question, which is what institutional and legal frameworks can foster systems change in line with business and human rights norms. So I have backgrounds in law. I studied law. I did a PhD in regulatory studies rather than law at ANU, and that was regulatory studies is really driven by this question of how incentives can be changed, how regulation, and that comes in many different forms, can shape behaviour. And for me, it's a kind of broader, more flexible method and approach than the type of approach that I learnt as a law student. And then I also I did a master's degree in development studies. So I really try to bring these different disciplines to bear on this question. And I think that one of the difficulties of doing a PhD or writing in this area is that it kind of necessarily requires us to be cross-disciplinary in our approaches. And that's tricky. It's tricky as scholars because it's hard to know exactly what audience you're speaking to, and CSR or corporate accountability, very broadly speaking, is addressed in so many different disciplines, and those disciplines have their own biases and particular angles that they're more interested in, and so it's hard, I think, often to know exactly where to locate your own research and which audience you're speaking to. But this is what animates my research, and so I'm kind of locate my work within the business and human rights kind of set or approach within CSR. And when I say human rights, I don't really just mean a human-centric approach. I'm interested in also, for example, the impact of climate change on human rights or on our world. So most of you, I think, will be familiar with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the three pillars that came out of that, which are currently kind of moving towards something more binding, although I think there's a long road and there's a big debate about whether an international treaty is going to be a positive thing, whether it will actually happen, and so on. But just to locate my research within that particular line of thinking. And I should say that my research isn't particularly kind of business-centric or business-focused. I'm more interested in the rights of communities and workers that are affected or interact with business. So I have a few projects that I'm currently working on, and Annie is part of most of them. So she'll probably cover it as well, and cover these points as well, so I'll just talk about them a little bit. But I tried to kind of put them into questions rather than topics, so that to kind of share the nature of those interests with you. So Annie and I were part of a very long multi-country study, in which we asked what the contribution of non-judicial mechanisms is. And part of the reason that we're interested in this is because there's been this proliferation of these new bodies, institutions, or problem-solving bodies, semi-judicial in form, and that are supposed to be adjudicating disputes between communities and workers and business when business breach the human rights of those communities or workers. And we wanted to find out what they were actually doing. And one of the reasons for that is because Ruggie, who was the architect of the UNGP's, United Nations Guiding Principles that I referred to earlier, saw them as sites of experimentation and because they're non-legal, because they're not kind of bound up in the same rules that we normally see, that they might actually be a site for learning and behavioural change. So that's one study that we've been working on for a long time, and we're writing a book now. I have a kind of broader interest in what international legal changes would foster fair conditions for workers in global supply chains, and that's driven by concern that there is this big governance gap because labour laws are national in scope, but work is now transnational, and the kind of significant influences and powers are transnational in scope, but we don't have a way to address that. And then a project that Annie and I are working on hard to get off the ground is asking how technology can be used to foster heightened human rights standards in supply chains and also empower workers. And I think that where we've landed with that is to have a focus on mobile phone technologies. So that's a little insight into my research, and I come at that research using different methodologies of different scales, but essentially I'm always interested in kind of what are the institutional structures that can make these work, that can change the incentives. Thanks.
Will I just go?
Okay. Let me get your PowerPoint.
Thanks. So thanks, Shelley, because that gave a really nice overview of some of the work, and so I thought I'd talk today about one specific project, which is a recent book that Shelley's also a co-author, so we sound like we're joined at the hip. And so that's about informal home-based work, which is not a topic that many researchers are looking at, and it's particularly looking at, I guess, down the supply chain, often at the very bottom of the supply chain, groups of workers who are considered marginalised, mainly women working at home, and thinking about, so this book is broader than just about corporate social responsibility, or really I use the term corporate accountability, and we can't look at this issue of marginalised workers, of home-based workers, without looking at CSR and the supply chain, because whether they like it or not, they become embedded in global supply chains because of the way global capital works. So I just want to show a brief video, because I haven't got to show it to anyone about the issue, so you get a... how I would look at this is, so the book is structured around having a gender justice approach. So this is looking at what are the structural issues that create inequalities. And that's framed around, potential, I guess the key issues of capitalism and patriarchy, and how this contributes to inequalities in society, and then how this links in terms of corporate behaviour, in terms of supply chains. And also the issues in terms of marginalised women workers broadly in society. So trying to link those two issues. And probably about a third of the book is looking at the issues of supply chains and how home workers can get recognition in the supply chain, but also linking up the whole really fundamental issues for women workers in the garment sector, which we're largely looking at, is about how their primary roles as mothers, carers, and carers of the environment and for the community, in terms of supporting the community, is undervalued and underpaid and invisible in society. So these factors really contribute to how then, when women undertake unpaid work, that this work is also undervalued. So when local companies, suppliers to global companies, don't value that women's work, nor do other companies, the principal companies contracting suppliers. So they remain invisible and unrecognised. So what we did in this book is looking at gender justice dimensions, and these dimensions are about recognition, rights, representation, and redistribution. So highlighting these 4 dimensions is about how social acknowledgement of home workers can be achieved, about valuing their work, about making them visible. About representation is essentially about self and collective advocacy and agency, activism and resistance, challenging those stereotypes, challenging those mechanisms that make them invisible. And the third dimension is about rights, is about ensuring basic labour right conditions, regulatory rights, as well as, if you want, moral rights. And the final dimension about redistribution is about challenging, correcting institutional, structural inequalities as injustices. So I just want to, lay that out very simply, because how we look at home workers in the supply chain is important in terms of how we conceptualise CSR and home worker recognition. So there's some theoretical concepts about CSR and homework we talk about, and these are framed around, firstly, how corporations address these kind of inequalities or issues in their supply chain. So one is, so there's 3, I guess, key ways that corporations and CSR, under the CSR model, looks at prohibition, that is outlawing or stopping homeworking being permitted in the supply chain. Tolerance is, okay, we accept it's there, but we're not going to do anything to improve their work conditions. Or engagement, which is about beyond tolerance, and it's about looking at ways that, probably from the corporate perspective, is about enhancing their reputation, but doing some, if you want, better things in terms of, and one example would be working with NGOs and unions to improve rights in the supply chain. But often this kind of approach is very siloed and focused on just one aspect of the supply chain and not generalised and not addressing the systemic issues. Another way of looking issues in terms of CSR is about compartmentalisation. So this is often about the really quite extreme different approaches companies take from CSR perspective in their CSR departments compared to their buyer sections of the company. So we see a really conflict of interest between CSR and reputation and enhancing, if you want, labour rights and human rights, as Shelley has outlined. But then we have the buyers section of the same company pushing companies to have lower prices, tighter deadlines, which have very real implications and compromise those CSR standards. And finally, about the logic of the supply chain. So looking at how the supply chain, the corporate structure of the supply chain uses existing inequalities of uneven development across different geographic scale of global north and global south companies, and use these type of inequalities to maintain control of workers. So, for example, moving to a location in India where child labour is very extensively used, knowing that they will benefit from cheaper prices by having child labourers, even though they have CSR policies against child labour. And then it might take a number of years before activists and unions campaign say there's child labour in the supply chain, and then they'll say, oh, this is terrible, we'll have to do something about it. So that's just a very brief overview of some of the, I guess, issues we take up in relation to homework, but they're really applicable across a whole range of work contexts in the formal sector and tier ones and subcontract workers at various stages of the supply chain. And finally, just there's, I guess, translating theory to practice is looking at how we use this knowledge to impact on change through researchers directly working with unions and NGOs, impacting on government policy, working indirectly or directly with corporations to improve the conditions of workers, social movement campaigns, NGOs and unions. So also a strong part of this research is driving this challenging a prevailing notion that home workers cannot be collectively organised. So using our research for good, if you want, in making sure that these workers do improve their rights and recognition. Thanks.
My name is Carol Bond, and I'm new to RMIT as of January. I've spent the last 12 years prior to arriving here at the University of Queensland. And the big question that drives my CSR research is how to include the most marginalized stakeholders in decisions made in large footprint industries. And I have a social and procedural justice ethical framework. So I'm very, very interested on how people are going to be affected by decisions and the integrity with which the decisions are made. Okay? My PhD is actually in political science, which I earned at the University of Queensland. I saw peace studies within the international studies discipline as a political science analog for CSR in the business management space. And I applied that in the mining context, which was a little bit unusual, but it seemed to work out all right. One of the things I found out very early on is that when I speak about peace to people in the mining industry, is people start sniggering. They laugh. They say, what on earth does peace have to do with mining? And I said, everything. Because mining can cause or exacerbate conflict in communities. And if you don't plan on dealing with that, and if you don't have an idea of how you're going to get to a more peaceful state of being, you're going to be constantly managing conflict over the life of that project. So I ended up having some really rich conversations with mining practitioners, government ministers, and also CSR practitioners on that very topic. And the idea of actually bringing that word peace into the room changes the entire conversation and gets people to stop having those automatic conversations because they don't have a ready answer for it. And they do end up actually collaborating much better around that. It's not an enormous insight, but it does help kind of dislodge conversations that are otherwise unproductive. You might gather from what I've said already that I have a master's degree in ethics because I'm very, very interested in the people saying one thing and doing another and trying to close the gap between expressed commitments and actually actions. And I bring that to my CSR work as well. In terms of a framework for management studies, so if we stay within the 1503 FOR codes, I'm very much interested in framing my research within the SDGs, keeping in line the planetary boundaries, which we're all becoming increasingly aware of. I've always had a human rights focus to my work. I've written on human rights in the mining space before, and I'm a big advocate for including indigenous wisdom, knowledges, and traditions in designing CSR approaches, even for non-indigenous communities. I reckon 65,000 years worth of knowledge probably can help us resolve some of the current issues we're dealing with that we may have forgotten some ways of knowing that might actually be helpful today. And I've recently been writing about degrowth economics, so that the constant surge for a greater GDP and a more robust bottom line is actually probably not going to help us stay within those planetary boundaries. I started my research work in the mining context in Queensland, mostly in the coal industry. So looking at the Galilee and Bowen basins and both the brownfield and greenfield projects there. Most of the time, people in the coal industry don't wake up in the morning and say, how can I screw up the world today? They just want to go get a job. And getting them to actually think about how they might do those jobs better and leave the environment and the communities behind in a much healthier space is not that hard of a conversation to have. They just haven't had the opportunity to have it. I also took some of the mining work on gold, into the gold and copper space in South America and Africa. Again, the corporations walking the talk. My favorite story is the Ahafo gold mine in Africa, where the Newmont Mining Corporation says they have these fantastic CSR platforms. You can look on their website. They're absolutely pitch perfect. Wonderful, wonderful. When then you get down to the ground and you talk to the CSR officers, it's a team of 14 of them. They're all from the local community. They've been empowered. And between 14 of them, they have one desk, one chair, one light bulb, one computer, one mobile phone, and one vehicle for 14 people. How are they supposed to do that agenda with that kind of discrepancy? So those are the kinds of issues I try to problematize with as a critical friend of industry, not as a critic, because industry doesn't particularly like coming up on side with a placard and saying, you naughty, naughty industry. And they'd rather say, how can I fix it? What can we do? I have worked heavily in the rapid development of the coal seam gas industry in Queensland. Some of the same lessons applied from the mining space. Coal seam gas is very different than mining. I can talk about that all day. But what I'm currently working on here at RMIT, I'm very excited about the opportunity to work in this university in particular because of the high reputation it has with industry. And on the Future Fuels CRC project, it was just launched last year. As part of the 19th round of CRCs, we've got a $96 million total worth of the project across 6 universities, 63 industry partners, regulatory bodies. We've got reams of researchers across these different universities, and we have to train 48 PhD students between us all. So that will be really interesting. But I'm working on the social stream, and the big project is to take the entire East Coast gas pipeline infrastructure, which is filled with fossil fuels for the most part, and water a little bit, and transform the fuel mix to hydrogen as a destination fuel. So we're going to completely decarbonize the Australian gas infrastructure. So how do we bring the community and industry along with that? Big question. So that's, right. Yeah. So I'm working on a series of staged projects to try to work as designed with industry in order to help them solve their CSR challenges, and understanding that they already have their CSR researchers, and trying to see what we can do to improve on or create a neutral space for them to come with collaborative solutions to the CSR challenges we're all going to face.